Dear audience, welcome to the show Power Chat. In today's episode, we are discussing on humanitarian relief and recovery activities in Nepal. Joining me today is Mr. David Smith, Country Director of DANCHA's Aid, also known as DCA. Please allow me to welcome him. Welcome to the show, Mr. Smith.
Thank you very much, Laxman.
How have you been?
Very well, thank you.
You are here for last 4.5 years or 4 years?
I just celebrated 4 years last week.
Okay. Tell us your impression over Nepal's development and diversity.
I found that development was going quite well until, of course, the earthquakes of 2015, which was a major setback. I was quite impressed by our program sort of response in the far west, because people were taking up a lot of initiatives, new technology, new ways of working, new ways of communicating, and so on. However, with the earthquake, the setbacks are there. We as an NGO would like to help people to get back to where they were before the earthquake, and then further progress on social development goals and so on.
Sometimes diversity is taken as obstacle to the process of development. How do you analyze the diverse linguistic, geographical, cultural situation of Nepal? You are here for last 4 years and working with different communities.
Well, funnily enough, I'm from Canada originally, and I find diversity to be crucial to the strength of a nation, because you are able, in diversity and inclusion, to bring in lots of different perspectives and ways of thinking that will help to strengthen the overall picture of the country. So through diversity, I think you get ideas, you get new ways of working, you get a lot of collaboration, and it enriches, I think, the identity of the country. So those parallels I have with my own country are kind of striking for me. That's why I appreciate very much being here in Nepal.
Well, could you highlight on the mandate of DANCHA's Aid, DCA, focusing on the areas of work, including that of the collaborations, the networks and campaigns you carry in the respective countries that you look after?
Thanks for asking me that, Laxman. Actually, DCA works globally in 11 countries, and in other countries as well, another 26, where we have smaller programs that are just punctual. Here in Nepal, we've been here since 2007 with an office, and just more recently in 2013, we expanded our program here. We've been working in livelihoods work, which is mainly agriculture, but also other types of livelihoods for rural people, mainly in the far west, where, in agreement with the Social Welfare Council, we've focused on very poor and vulnerable communities. So within livelihoods, it includes bringing more vulnerable groups such as Dalits, more ethnic communities, elderly and disabled into the mainstream so they get access to services. Linked to livelihoods, we also work on disaster risk reduction, which means helping communities to organize and prepare themselves.
I will come back to you on the humanitarian and post-disaster recovery programs. What is the response of the public that you are working with, especially in Nepal?
In terms of the disaster response, or
overall program of your office?
I think what people generally like about the way we work is we work through the community. We try to work through all the time in everything we do through local organizations and through the communities to strengthen what they do, what kind of resources they have available to actually try to face a problem that they have, rather than us saying this is what's good for you. I think what they appreciate is that we ask them what they think needs to be done, and we try to adjust what we do to what they say. More than anything, I think that's what I would assume people would appreciate from our support.
Well, there are more than 40,000 NGOs working in Nepal. How do you partner with the local NGOs and or civil society organizations, particularly that of your activities and mandate?
We have tried to partner with NGOs who are both very strong at the national level in order to influence what's happening, good practice, advocacy on policy issues, and with others who work and have their roots at the district level. who understand what the real needs are at the district level, who have good connections with communities, with government, with other NGOs that are working there. That strengthens what they do because they can't do everything. So we try to identify our partners in terms of what the priorities are that are local, where they have the strengths, and where they can also say, we're working with these others who bring in some technology, they bring in sort of access to another service, so that there's a more complete support to communities.
Well, Mr. Smith, how do you look at the state of humanitarian recovery and relief program, especially after the big earthquake that occurred in Nepal 2 years back? There are several organizations working in the areas addressing these issues. How do you see the programs in general and the activities of your organization in particular, especially their effectiveness?
Well, first of all, Laxman, I'd like to say that the response was very inspiring for us to see ordinary people just going out and doing something and supporting their neighbors or supporting people in the most vulnerable communities. Just ordinary people decided they wanted to collect relief items and go out. Subsequent to that, the international response, which is where we're coming from, I think was quite strong. A lot of organizations came in with the usual challenges of coordination and so on initially, but overall I think that those were overcome because people were talking to each other and saying, in water and sanitation, this is what we're doing, in livelihoods, this is what we're doing, in shelter and so on. From our perspective, it's crucial as DCA to work within all of these networks. So cluster organizations or other types of meeting together under the auspices and the leadership of government is crucial. We work through that so that we understand what the priorities are for the national plan and how we can implement them in order to avoid duplicating with another NGO or whatever, in order to actually get some advantage from what the other one is doing, so that what you're doing in shelter or livelihoods complements rather than duplicates what others are doing. So I think that was effective in the relief phase in the first, say, 4 to 6 months. Subsequent to that, our perspective and that of a lot of NGOs is to look at the longer term. So you're going from the relief needs of people to then recovering their shelter, recovering their water supply, recovering their livelihoods over the next, let's say, 5 years, to be realistic. So we are trying to look at the longer term perspective to see how can we actually build with the community over the longer term, invest in the community so that they get back to where they were.
Mr. Smith, you raised a very important issue on how the effects of such disasters could be addressed in the long term, that of these sustainable programs. Based on your experience, would you be analyzing the immediate works after such disasters be done by the organizations or stakeholders, and the long-term plans so that there is a kind of preparedness from the community parts?
Exactly. I think that in some areas we could see people were a little bit better prepared, but nobody can be prepared for such a massive disaster as these earthquakes. Therefore, most communities were in a difficult situation. In the recovery phase now, people that are being given training and support on how to do their own community plan about, okay, what if there's an earthquake? What if there's a flood or a fire or whatever? This is what we can do, this is what we cannot do. Here is how we can prepare, say, to put stocks of food aside, to protect our animals and our people if there's a flood, and so on and so forth. So this is happening as part of the longer term, so that the next time something happens, they'll be able to cope, at least for most things. Of course, they'll need help from the government and other bodies such as NGOs to help to maybe solve some of the problems that are bigger. But that's the thinking.
Well, Mr. Smith, DCA is facilitating a new initiative called Charter for Change. Would you highlight on this initiative, Charter for Change, with its key commitments or action plan and the expected results?
If you recall, Laxman, in May 2015, there was a World Humanitarian Summit in Turkey, And at that summit, there was a lot of attention paid to local organization and how they can actually respond more effectively in a lot of cases to a disaster than somebody parachuting in like an INGO or another entity. So as a result of the World Humanitarian Summit, there was an initiative called Charter for Change amongst the international NGOs. What the INGOs realized was that very little of the funds from, say, these global appeals to support earthquake response in Nepal or Syria or elsewhere was getting to the local organizations who know best what needs to be done. 0.2%, in fact, of all that money was going to those local organizations. So we as INGOs...
You mean globally?
Globally. This is globally, not necessarily in Nepal, just globally. We felt as INGOs that that needed to change, that more of that funding needed to go to local NGOs who could do a more effective job. And we've pledged by May 2018, there are 29 INGOs that have signed up to this charter, that figure will be 20% of what we have for humanitarian aid would go to local organizations. In addition to that, I think we've also committed to supporting the capacity building and the organizational strengthening of local partners. We are also pledging to commit to having them as full partners. When we develop a project, it's with the local partner throughout the whole process. We are not imposing on them, we are talking together as equals. And that would include having opportunities like this to tell the public and other development actors and humanitarian actors, this is what all of us should be aspiring to. This is an aspiration. We want this to happen. We want people to look at it and yes, this makes sense. It's a way of really supporting local initiatives, local strengthening, so that eventually we as INGOs do ourselves out of a job.
What are the changes that this new initiative expect to have within few years?
Besides,
can you mention them in the numbers 1, 2, 3 or 4?
Yeah, I'd say
changes
besides
expected.
this, 20% of our funding will go to local organizations directly. In the case of Nepal, obviously that is much higher because the INGOs are following the directives of the government, which are correct, of 80%. However, globally, we want everybody to do that. We will support the capacity. We will have very strong long-term plans to support the capacity of our local partners. Our local partners will be linked directly to funding sources, donors and so on, as well as through us in order to get easier access to these funding opportunities. Any sort of communications will be where we present ourselves as equal partners. Our local partner and DCA are equal. This is the way we want to present ourselves. This is the way we believe we should be working. So the gist of it is that. In addition to that, it's also to reassert the principles of transparency and accountability to everyone. And I think that's crucial, and I'll probably talk about it a little bit more.
Well, Mr. Smith, I was trying to come to the points you are describing. How can transparency and accountability be maintained in humanitarian works or support? Often there is media and civil society criticism on the activities carried out by the development organizations for not maintaining transparency in the resources they use, and the funds are sometimes not properly utilized.
Yeah, first of all, just to link with the Charter for Change, when they say transparency, that means we've also all committed as the 29 INGOs that are signatories, that we will use a unique process at a global level to present all of the figures for where we're working, how much we are providing to local organizations, how much we're providing in which sector for humanitarian support, in a system where everybody measures it equally as well. Now this is a challenge. We may have people who measure what is actually going to the local NGO in a different way. So this is kind of the technical side of it, where the negotiations are well underway at the moment, where we're trying to define, we talk about the same thing globally anywhere we are. So that means we will be completely transparent in terms of the funds that we're providing globally for humanitarian aid. That's one thing. I think in the context of Nepal, of course, all NGOs who are registered with the Social Welfare Council will report regularly to the Social Welfare Council. We will have full agreements with them. They will have full information and accountability on what we're doing, how much the budget is, where it is, with whom, and so on and so forth. And they have to sign off on that, otherwise we can't do anything. Also, we are all, as international NGOs, particularly those under the Association of INGOs in Nepal, reporting to the Ministry of Finance, to the Aid Monitoring Division, so that the information is available on the ministry's website on how much DCA is bringing in each year and where it's going. So all NGOs are doing that as well. In addition, now in the recovery phase, many of the works that we're doing are through the NRA, the National Reconstruction Authority, so we're also reporting to them. So, okay, that may not be enough. So we put our information on our websites, we try to do communiques and so on as groups or as individual NGOs to continue to inform the press, the media in general, government and the public what we're doing. But we need to continuously do that. I think it's a challenge for us.
Well, Mr. Smith, what is your observation about the performance of different NGOs working in the humanitarian or relief and recovery works? Also, would you comment on the facilitation or obstacles? Sometimes there are obstacles created by the state agencies as well. How do you work with both the NGOs and the state agencies? Are they supportive enough to your work?
I think we've had some challenges in terms of the registration of some of our agreements. There have been some delays in those. But having said that, I think generally the performance of INGOs has been reasonable. There have been delays due to the negotiations about how to do shelter, as you know full well, how NGOs can participate in that reconstruction process. I think in other sectors there have been also delays due to the closure of the border for 4 months last year, which was critical in terms of bringing in materials for reconstruction, including of water systems and not just of housing. So that's been a big challenge for us. It slowed us down somewhat. As a consequence, I think INGOs, and I have to say the donor community, the UN and government, have gone to other alternatives. I think the INGOs took initiatives to do cash transfer programming. INGOs were amongst the first to do that. And that helped to kind of demystify it because there were fears that it wouldn't be spent properly by people. We've seen that using cash rather than having to depend on imported materials was a solution that overcame that blockade. But it did slow things down somewhat because of the blockade. So now people are catching up. I think, as is our case, as DCA, as other INGOs, we're speeding up now our process of trying to repair the water systems in Gorkha and Dading, trying to complete the rehabilitation of sanitation installations in households, in schools, and so on. Those things were slowed down. I believe now it's speeding up, it's picking up quite well. But then again, if we look at, we see the recovery phase is always going to be a more gradual, longer-term process. So we need to also be realistic, saying these things will take time.
Well, Mr. Smith, I'm asking you a question beyond DCA's work, but that represents the humanitarian issue. You talked much on the blockade. What is the role of the donor community or UN agencies or the diplomatic community at the time of such blockades? It's a humanitarian issue.
Yeah, exactly. There was quite a lot of discussion, as you would imagine, a lot of very strong debate amongst all the actors, including INGOs. Many of us were trying to convince the donors to push for humanitarian corridors in order for things to come in. It didn't really happen. To a degree it might have happened. We were able to bring in some things, but it was quite limited. We were able to adjust with the donors' support using more, say, air freight to get things in, which was more effective, but very costly, and a little bit dependent, of course, on the amount of funding and the availability of helicopters and so on and so forth. So that was quite limited. So again, which is why our thinking was, we have to live with this. It may not be resolved quickly, despite the donors maybe putting some informal pressure to open the blockade and the border. So we have to do cash transfer programming. We have to adjust how we do things, relying on people's local resources. I think in reality, that's what was practical for us to do. So our expectations were also limited that the donors could resolve the problem quickly. We believed that they could only have a certain level of, I think, influence.
Well, Mr. Smith, we are coming to the end of the show. I have one question for you. Could you figure out the impact of humanitarian support in general and the results of your work here in Nepal, especially that of the aid effectiveness, monitoring and evaluation?
Yeah, getting back to aid effectiveness and how we monitor those results, a lot of NGOs are now using technology, mobile phone applications, to actually ask people in communities on a regular basis, are you happy with what's going on? Are you happy with DCA? Are you happy with our local partner? Are you happy in general with government, other entities, and their support to you? Now this is happening more and more amongst NGOs. We integrate those questions in our overall monitoring. The monitoring of, okay, how many water systems have we fixed? How many trainings have been done? And so on and so forth. It's integrated there. On a monthly basis, we look at the results and say, in Gorkha, in a particular VDC, they're not happy with us just focusing on livelihoods. They want us to work more on the water systems. So we have to adjust. And as a result, we can adjust and show in electronic form much more accurately that we're responding to local needs. We can show those data much more in the public eye so that people can see on a very regular basis every month if there's progress or not. I think that's encouraging. More of us have to do it. We need to put it out there more often. We need to be communicating more through the benefit of your questions, but also across media, so that there is a better understanding of what we're actually doing and a breaking down of barriers and perceptions about what we're doing.
Well, Mr. Smith, thank you very much for your time. Pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very much, Laxman.
Dear audience, time now to wrap up the show. Keep watching us. See you next week. Namaste.